This is Under the Tree, a seminar on freedom with Bill Ayers.
So our next segment is guest speaker, artists, authors, activists, after hours. And today we're very excited to be joined by the wonderful Crystal Laura. Thanks for joining us under the tree, Crystal.
I'm happy to be here.
I'd like to talk to you a bit about yourself, about your book, Being Bad, and then a bit about the situation we're living through. But first, tell us a bit about yourself. You're a professor at Chicago State University. Say more.
I am. I'm coming up on year 10 as a professor of educational leadership at Chicago State.
You're kidding me. 10?
I know, right? Time just flies.
You were a student of mine 10 years ago. My God.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, it's crazy.
So it's pretty close to a decade. It's been a fun ride. My work there is mostly focused on helping people who are on the road toward the superintendency think deeply about the world and bring lenses of justice and equity to their work as administrators and leaders and practitioners, which is always a fun and interesting challenge that I learn from every single day. Chi State is also where I learned to swim. It's also where the first person who got an advanced degree in my family, graduated from. It's also in my neighborhood. So, Chicago State holds a special place in my heart. I'm also a writer and a mom and someone who thinks a lot about preserving myself as a human in order to be here for the good work that needs to happen in my family and in the world, and which means that I'm a vegan and I'm a yogi, and I try to take good care of myself. And I try to be a good human.
That's great. That's a full-time job in itself, and you're an artist of your own life trying to be a good human. We've known each other for about 15 years, so it goes back, but it's great to see you today. I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit about your book, Being Bad. I was there from the beginning of that, but I think it's a profound work. Maybe you tell us a little bit about the origin of it, how you came to write it, what it's about, what you learned from the process.
Yeah. So Being Bad, my baby brother in the school to prison pipeline, is inspired by, as the title suggests, my brother, Chris, who I just saw last night, and it fills my heart to see him in the real world, because not very long ago, I didn't get to see him in the real free world. I got to see him over and over again in jails and prisons throughout Illinois. So this book really is a precursor to him becoming incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections. And it's really my attempt to make sense of how it could be that a young Black man in and around Chicago could be so disconnected from institutions that are supposed to be designed to support him and nurture him and love on him, how he could be so disconnected from those institutions and then be wrapped up in systems that are designed for his institutionalization and for living a life of retribution. So this book was something I started under your tutelage, which is a beautiful thing to reminisce on. I miss being a full-time student. But in any case, I was, at the time that this was beginning, I was teaching at a high school on the west side of Chicago for formerly incarcerated folks. At that time, the school was called St. Leonard's Adult High School, and now it's called Sister Jean Hughes Adult High School. And, the work that I was doing there was, I was teaching some history classes. I was teaching some Afghan history classes. I was teaching communications classes. And these were all to folks who had not finished their high school education. So this was not a GED program. It's really a way to complete what they started, but got interrupted because they got locked up. So I was teaching there and also taking odd jobs because I was a broke doctoral student, and that's what broke doctoral students do. And another of my odd jobs was kind of subbing and finding ways to just hang out in Chicago public schools. So I had these three things that were kind of happening all at once. I had my brother who was really having problems in school and getting into a lot of trouble in the streets. I had the students who I was teaching at the high school who were formerly incarcerated folks who were telling me all kinds of stories that just seemed to resonate with me, to connect with me, to sound familiar to me. And then I had these students who I was interacting with in Chicago public schools in a variety of capacities, but usually as a sub. I taught summer school also. So I saw some real clear connections between those three kinds of people, or three different stories. And I wanted to I felt like there was a connection, and I wanted to write about that connection, but there are things in universities that make it difficult for you to do you, and make it difficult for you to say what you think, and kind of cut the shit. And so I struggled with that for quite a long time. And actually I wrote something entirely different. I wrote like three different things that danced around this idea of the school to prison pipeline, and wasn't about my brother at all, at least, explicitly. It was always about him underneath the underbrush. But it was really only when I started studying with you and my network grew of people who really focus on connecting the personal and political, and really don't work to make, distinctions between those two worlds, and understand that you show up as a whole person wherever you go. And it was really that moment that I began to see, like, wait a minute, no, let me write what's really on my mind, and let me really try to make sense of what's going on at my home. And I think if I do that in an authentic way, in a real way, in a way that feels like it's beginning to articulate what's on my heart, that in itself will speak to other people's stories and their lives. And I bet some people will see their brothers and their cousins and themselves perhaps in the stories that I tried to tell authentically. So this book, my first book, is about the stories that I accumulated through conversations with my brother, through conversations with my parents, my sister, through looking at old newspapers, clippings that were about the school systems that he navigated, through talking to school resource officers. I talked to anybody who would talk to me about my brother and his background in order to piece together retrospectively what could have led to the moment that we ended up at, which was essentially him getting into a lot of trouble legally and eventually heading off to prison. So I mentioned when I first started talking about the book and the title of the book that I got to see my brother yesterday in the free world. And so, the span of that, the time since I wrote that book has been about 5 years, 6 years. So it's enough time for me to be speaking now from the scar rather than the wound. But he's home, and so am I.
Wow, the scar and not the wound. That's pretty impressive, because you mean the scar never really goes away. The wound may be healed, but the scar doesn't go away.
Absolutely. There's a kind of distance that at least enables me to communicate without bursting into tears. And that took a really long time.
I get it. I get it. Yeah. So you really write this book, Being Bad, and it's about the school to prison pipeline. How do you see that pipeline now? And what do you tell teachers who are working with kids like you were and like Chris was? What do you tell them that they can learn from the kind of deep dive you did into this phenomenon of the school to prison pipeline?
Yeah. The school to prison pipeline, to me, when I wrote the book, I was really just trying to make sense of it. I'm not, to be honest, I wasn't entirely sure that I knew what the hell I was talking about. And I used the book to try to get as clear as I could. But no book is a happy ending, if we're being honest with ourselves anyway, as writers. Like, we're not trying to tie a neat bow and make sure we have all the answers. We're trying to nudge the needle a bit, and we're trying to get clear about what it is that we don't quite understand. So in the time since I finished the book, and, spoiler alert to the folks who may read the book pending our post our conversation, I don't end that book with a neat ending.
Right.
And it's not intentional, it's just what it is. But in the time since I finished the book, I think I've become a lot clearer, at least about how to articulate what I think I've learned. And part of that just comes from a lot of time talking to other educators, people asking me blunt questions about the school to prison pipeline, me reading a lot more. But the school to prison pipeline is essentially, it is a pathway that is paved for vulnerable young people with the support of lots of other people and institutions. So when I'm talking to educators, I get even more specific. I say that the school to prison pipeline is the result of school policies, practices, and processes that we as adults create in school spaces and that young people have to navigate. And so the result of those school policies, practices, and processes often means that rather than creating spaces, educational spaces, learning spaces that young people feel whole and happy in, instead, these are spaces that young people need to recover from. So it gives us a frame to think about, like, what does that mean actually? Well, then we can keep talking very specifically about the school policies, practices, and processes that researchers, that youth activists, that young people themselves, that educators, that all of us are beginning to rally around in terms of clarity, that, man, we've actually had on the record for a really long time that certain ways of dealing with student behavior have been really problematic for a really long time. What's relatively new, I think, is our clarity as writers and thinkers and activists around the kind of creativity that we have as educators with the ways in which we manage student behavior. So oftentimes it's surprising when I talk to educators about how our curricular choices are often connected to the ways in which we manage behavior, right? Like those two things aren't entirely separate, that there's a such thing as curriculum violence, that you can create a whole set of plans that actually are inflicting what you might call learning lacerations or school wounds on young people who are really just trying to come up and see classrooms as mirrors and windows, right? They want to come into a space and see reflections of themselves in their real lives. And they want to come into a space and be able to see a bigger world outside of that space through the prism of their real lives. And when they get neither of those, when they don't feel that learning spaces are created for them by them, then that's another opportunity, I think, for us, a missed opportunity for us as educators to affirm young people and schools as spaces where young people belong, and instead encourage them to look elsewhere for fulfilling the basic need of belonging and safety and affirmation. So I get real clear with educators about lots of specific things that we could be doing differently. And I think that's really just, again, I've been able to develop that kind of clarity with time and in lots of conversations with other educators who are really committed to doing right by young people and who want to kind of collectivize together and think together about what that could look like.
Say a little more about what kinds of things folks can do and how they get framed. I mean, you talk about curricular wounds. What are the things that prevent those wounds or that go in a different direction?
Yeah. This is always interesting and fun. I think it's important that we start, before we start thinking about policies and practices, that we start thinking about how we think. And I know that sounds like hella meta, and maybe a little bit too, philosophical for the moment, but just stay with me. I think so much of what we do is shaped by how we think and how we talk. So if we want to start thinking about what we can do by way of new policies, new reforms, et cetera, to really support young people and make sure that we're not creating or nurturing or supporting young people along this pathway to prison, and instead really creating opportunities for greater participation in our democracy, then I think we should be thinking like, okay, what are the ways in which we talk to each other, talk to ourselves about young people, and what are the narratives that enable that kind of speech, right? So I think focus on teacher talk, how we talk to ourselves and how do we talk to each other is like really, really important. Lately, I've been really into social media spaces, not actually participating in them so much, but rather looking at them like a researcher and thinking about just observing the conversations that happen in such spaces. But anyway, I think that if we think about young people in ways that are problematic, racialized, gendered, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, if we are thinking that certain populations of young people won't do, can't do, don't that have the capacity to do, don't have parents who support them to do, don't come from communities and families and schools that enable them to do. If that's the kind of deficit thinking that's grounded in all kinds of assumptions about dysfunction and defiance, if we assume not the good in young people and their families, but we assume that there is something inherently wrong with young people, then there is absolutely no wonder why we call them bad. We call them troublemakers. We call them class clowns. We call them, one book that inspired my first book was Bad Boys by Ann Ferguson, where she documents the young people, young Black boys as young as 9 or 10. My oldest son, as you know, Bill, is 10. So I know what 10 looks like. So I can visualize the scene that she writes about. And she says that they're young Black boys as young as 9 and 10 years old in this school who are described by school adults, the people who are supposed to be there to serve them, right? The people who are supposed to be there to treat them as if these babies are their own babies, describing them as unsalvageable and bound for jail, sometimes in their presence. So the idea that Zach, my 10-year-old, is being described this way just like hits me right in my soul.
Yeah.
So, that our capacity to think about young people in certain ways that are unhelpful and damaging and damage-centered and moving away from a pedagogy of love and a pedagogy of justice and a pedagogy of joy. And then inform our speech. The way we think about folks shapes the way we speak about folks, and the way we speak about folks then shapes the ways in which we interact with people, and the shapes our thinking about and the ways in which we do policy, practice, and process, right? So those three things to me, oh my gosh, it's driving me nuts. These three things to me are connected. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we can talk about what does your discipline policy look like? We can say, what does your curriculum look like? We can ask about the politics of the teacher's lounge, which, by the way, every time I talk to a rookie teacher, I'm like, you better stay far, far away from the teacher's lounge, because that, oftentimes that's where, a lot of this hype, these narratives are crafted and circulated, right? About who's going to be on your roster next year. Good luck, I'm pretty sure so-and-so is going to drive you nuts, with all these stories just get passed down. So we can talk about what's the culture of your space. What does the climate feel like? Who has healthy relationships and who doesn't? I tell you, Bill, this moment of being in absolute crisis as a global community, I think really reminds me so much of lots of things, but two things in particular. One is community and one is care. I'm so lucky, and I feel really lucky to have, as an educator, but then also just as a human, to have as a principal connecting and trying to band with folks through a collective. I've been so appreciative for my kids' teachers. They've taught me so much over the past 2 months about the importance of creating healthy, sustainable relationships with your students and with their families. And then also, we're in this moment where everybody's thinking about self-care as community care. And I feel like 2 months ago, I would have said that message and shouted it from the rooftops as a yogi, like we should be taking care of ourselves. And people would be looking at me like, how selfish is that?
You're a hippie,
now I feel,
right?
Yeah,
you're a hippie.
But now I think we're in this moment of a whole lot of hippies where, we have a greater capacity to see that, creating an abundance in yourself, generating an abundance in yourself enables then to take better care of the folks around you. And, that too, when we're talking about the school to prison pipeline, if you are unwell, if you are unhappy, if you are coming at this job because you've been doing it the same way for 10 years, for 20 years, and that's just what you do, and you're the senior in the building and you have your tenure, and that's just, if you're coming at it with dogmatism, you're coming at it with, without a sense of curiosity and interest in being a student even as a teacher, right? Like continuing to be a student, then I think we need to have a conversation about that. In fact, what I often tell people when I'm on the road, what I often tell folks, quite frankly, first I tell them to please excuse the Chicago in me, and then I tell them that if you are not joyful, if you are not coming at this work from a place of pleasure, then there are lots of other professions. Right. Because we have babies who need people who enjoy this opportunity, this essential work of teaching.
So you say a pedagogy of love, justice, and joy, and you talk about communities of care. In a certain way, I mean, I would think that the opposite of that is what you're fighting against, and really the opposite of that does not allow you to be a free person. I mean, if it's all hatred, anger, injustice, the sense of being wronged, how do you be a free person in that? And in some ways, you're advocating a pedagogy toward freedom, toward
absolutely
being a fully developed human and a free human.
Absolutely. Three-dimensional, fully human. Part of what I think is necessary when we're thinking about teaching and a pedagogy of love, justice, and joy is that we focus on criticality. So like not so much the capacity to develop well-reasoned arguments, right? Because my audience is largely educators, right? So we are educated, we are highly credentialed, we got experience and all that. So I'm not talking about that, but I think, criticality in the way in which we think about justice and liberation, that we think that there are ways in which you can think about the world that that enables you to constantly rethink and consciously push against the way things are and really reimagine how things can be otherwise, and asking those kinds of difficult questions. Well, we have this policy where if you, and you know this, Bill, this is a thing. Oh, we have this dress code policy that if you come to school as a student and you have locks in your hair, again, as my 10-year-old son does, if you have locks in your hair, or if you have braids or twists or anything else that really resembles being a Black person in America, that it is against the rules. We have school districts that have on record, on paper, that it is against school rules to show up that way. So if you are if you're not a critical person, right, you might have all kinds of excuses about why that's totally reasonable. You want, if you want kids to be alike, you want to develop a sense of continuity. I'm actually even struggling to think of why somebody would think that's cool. But a critical person, on the other hand, would say, who does that hurt? Who does that marginalize? What kinds of stories are we bringing into our school policies? What kinds of racialized problematic histories are we re-invoking? Are we recreating? How does that make young people feel? How does it make the young person who actually has the locks feel? And then what does that mean for other students who are watching this one student be plucked out and ostracized and pushed away, right? So these are the kinds of critical questions that someone would ask. So I think criticality is essential. I think part of criticality is being clear about the fundamental non-negotiable principles through which you do your work. So rather than coming at teaching like, oh, I love the kids. Okay, cool. That will only get you so far. So what else are you doing in teaching, right? What else is bringing you to this incredibly challenging but incredibly rewarding experience that is being a teacher? What is it that is driving you, so that when all the shit hits the fan, when we're in the middle of a pandemic and nobody knows what's going on, and you've been told to go online, but you don't know anything about that, and you've been told, like, when all this stuff is crazy, or whatever you can imagine the next version of crazy, because we will get there, you need to have something that's holding your feet to the ground, right? Like, how are all 10 toes staying to the ground if you just show up because you love the kids? So I think that if we are coming at teaching from a place of love and justice and joy, then that means we need to be clear about whatever the fundamental non-negotiable principles are through which we do our work. Now, you know this about me, Bill, that yoga is life. So it's really easy for me to then see like this core connection piece as a person who's really into the wisdom of the body, and into fitness. I think a lot about the strength of physically your core, and how like the tiniest of movements, just me gesticulating while I'm on the phone with you, how all of these movements are passing through my core. And if I don't have a strong one, then the body will compensate. It will compensate with my lower back. It will compensate with my knees. It'll like do other things to really catch up and make up for the fact that my inner core isn't solid. I firmly believe that the same is true educationally. So physiologically, that's true, but I think the same is true educationally. That if you don't have at your core a set of non-negotiable principles through which you do your work, and you just show up any kind of way, that somebody is going to get hurt.
Yep.
So criticality, curriculum that is grounded in young people's real lives, care, and a sense of collectivity and sustainable relationships. I think that those four things could really create learning environments that young people want to be in, and that we as educators want to help co-create.
Wow, I can't tell you. Every time I talk to you, I learn so much. I'm over here taking notes. I really appreciate that, Crystal. I want to hit one more thing before we have to come to an end, and that is that I know your brother Chris mostly through your writing and through knowing you very well, but I've met him a couple times, once in county jail in Cook County and once outside of county jail. He's a lovely guy, and I want you to just tell me quickly. I was so happy to hear that he got let out of Illinois state prisons just before the pandemic blew up in Illinois. So he escaped that kind of death house that's been created. But he was in for what, almost a decade?
He was in for 6 years.
Oh, only 6
over
years.
6.
Okay.
He was in for only 6 years.
Yeah, I like that.
I'm gonna tell him you said that.
Yeah, easy for me to say. Yeah, right.
When we were just talking yesterday over dinner, he was telling stories, which he hasn't done. I haven't asked. I kind of waited for him to. I want to just follow his lead. I don't want to go in with all kinds of like weird questions about what it was like, although I'm really curious about what it was like, but I assume that those things will come out when he's ready. So yesterday, for the first time, something came out where he was talking about the politics of using the phone, right? So throughout the 6-year course, there were lots of moments where he was straight up frustrated, like, why didn't you all answer the phone? And of course, because I'm out here in the free world, quote, I'm out here in the free world, I don't think about things like I missed the call, like I know we'll talk again very soon. Of course I want to talk to him, but like it wasn't tragic. And I knew that he would be frustrated, but then of course we would talk, a few hours later, and then that'd be fine. So just yesterday, he's telling us the story about the politics of the phone, right? And it blew me away to think about the kinds of resourcefulness that you build inside, the kinds of communication skills, like a whole new code and way of thinking and being that you have to figure out, adapt to, learn, respect, teach to other younger people who come in or newer folks who come inside. That just kind of blew me away. Way too much about that story. But my point is, I don't know much about what it was like for him to have spent the last 6 years there. I know I will at some point, but right now what I know is that he is home, that he is acclimating to the best of his ability, that he's now in trucking school, that he is trying to just take it one day at a time and take good care of himself. But you're right. He got out, escaped. I mean, of course, the right time to get out would have been, 6 years
ago, right?
But he got out just before we began to learn about how the spread was impacting folks who are incarcerated. And I've been on a bunch of calls with activists here in Illinois who are trying to catalog what's happening and make sure they archive it and publicize all kind of information to make sure that that doesn't escape public view, that prison issues generally tend to escape public view, right? By design, even down to like where they're located. Like you don't put a prison next to the H&M, you don't put it next to the Starbucks, you don't put it next to whatever your tourist attraction is. You put it way away, tucked away in some rural community where folks don't have to see it or deal with it. So I think that activist folks are really trying to stay on top of what's happening with incarcerated people in COVID, given that there are all these examples of ways in which people try to not see the prison problem. And, you know, I just feel so much, I have so much love for families who, you know, have incarcerated folks right now. And I can't, yeah, my heart goes out to folks who are, who will love on somebody who is incarcerated right now.
Yeah.
The experience itself is awful, tragic. Nobody should ever experience being incarcerated, loving on somebody who's incarcerated. But this moment, wow, just puts a whole other layer on what's going on.
Well, you know, my son Chesa, who's a district attorney in San Francisco, has reduced the jail population by over 40% in 2 months. It's something that should happen nationwide. And, you know, Chesa's other father is in prison in New York State. So I feel what you're saying. And I want you to, I'm so happy for you, for your mom, for your whole family, and for Chris. And please give him my best wishes and tell him I hope to see him soon. As soon as this lockdown is over, we'll have a big dinner and celebrate Chris. Listen, Crystal, I want to just thank you so much. This is Crystal Laura. Her book is Being Bad, My Baby Brother and the School to Prison Pipeline. You really should read it. It's instructive on 1,000 levels. And just as Crystal was saying here, it ends with a very, very clear sense of what we could all be doing to disrupt and dismantle the school to prison pipeline. So Crystal, thank you for spending so much time with me. Really appreciate you on 1,000 levels. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks, Bill.